Because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot of enemies.
Welcome, everyone, to the fourth episode of In Defense of Climate Change. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm joined once again by climate policy scholar Roger Pielke Jr., who's a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and author of the popular science policy Substack, The Honest Broker. And he's here today to talk about the big news that's happened in climate science and climate policy, updating the climate models. So I would say, or the scenarios or the models that we talked about in our first episode of this series. I'm going to lead by saying you recently wrote a Washington Post op-ed, the opening line of which said, "The climate apocalypse isn't around the corner after all." So can you recap all of the exciting news that's been happening over the last few weeks on this front?
Yeah, and it's great to be with you, Bryce. And it's also weird to be talking about climate scenarios and exciting news all in the same time, because this is some pretty esoteric, down in the weeds stuff. But as I've said, it's super important. I had a line in that Washington Post op-ed that it got tweaked a little by the editor. But I mean, the reality is that climate scenarios touch everybody on the planet, whether you know what they are, where they come from, what they do. They're really important. And, they started out as just a tool for doing some good science, and they escaped from the science garden out into the real world, and they affect everybody. So, if you want, I can just give kind of a nutshell, kind of what happened and why it matters.
Yeah, please do, because I'm very excited. By the way, like, you've been featured in all of these recent videos. John Stossel had a really nice profile of you, and this news was tweeted out by the White House, and President Trump frankly commented on it. So I mean, kudos to you. Like, this is great. So you've been working on this and talking about this for so long, and so I'm very excited for you. And it's been great to see this just emerge over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. It's a good indication that science is self-correcting. One day when it's widely recognized where COVID came from, we can do another sort of podcast, but it's of similar magnitude, actually, I would say. Let's start at the beginning. So when scientists project the future of the climate system, they use what are called Earth system models. And they're models that are based on physics of the Earth, chemistry, just the sort of egg-headed things most people would think of when they think of models. But before you get to that point, before we talk about the physics of the climate system, we have inputs. And those inputs are based on socioeconomic assumptions. And by that, I mean, how many people are going to be on the planet? How big is our economy going to be? How are we going to burn fuels? What are we going to put energy to use for? That matters because the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the amount of aerosols or pollution that's out there, how we change the land surface, all of that feeds into how we change the climate. And let me say at the outset, climate change is real. Humans are affecting the climate system. It presents significant risks, and we should be dealing with it. And so none of that changes. But for the last 15, 20 years, the models that scientists use to project future climate have depended upon scenarios of the world that, in one word, are implausible. They're based on a theory from the 1980s and 1990s that said that we were going to burn all the coal, not just all the coal, but 10 times more coal than we know exists. And we're going to do that to replace solar, wind, natural gas, nuclear, name your favorite technology. Eventually, not just eventually, we would already be on the path of replacing oil with liquids from coal. We're not doing that. And Unfortunately, that assumption was baked into all of the scenarios, but one in particular, the most extreme scenario, called RCP 8.5. It's the one Trump tweeted about, which has dominated research, policymaking, regulation, bank regulations, you name it. It's out there. So what happened was last month, the committee, and we could talk about that also because it is odd that this little international science committee determines scenarios that affect everybody, but they retired the most extreme scenarios. So it wasn't just RCP 8.5, it was its more extreme successor and then another very extreme scenario, and have proposed a new scenario set that brings down not just only brings down the highest scenario to a lower level. Um, it also says, well, our highest scenario is a what if exercise. We don't think that's where the world's headed. And so the course correction in terms that many people might understand. So the Paris Agreement said we're going to aim for a 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase by 2100. So 2 degrees was the kind of the marker of success. The extreme scenarios projected something approaching 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. So a big number. The new projection based on current policies is at about 2.6, 2.7, 2.4, somewhere in there, depending on it's early days, depending on what climate emulator you use. But it's about a 2 degree shaving of the projected where we're headed, which is enormous in a climate context. And so what's going to happen, we're only in the early days, what's going to happen is that all of this research, all of this policy, all this regulation is going to have to be reconsidered in light of the fact that the scenario that they're built on doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's out there in the world, but it's not viewed to be a plausible representation of the future. And so that's going to be painful, uncomfortable, resisted, and problematic for a lot of folks. But it's going to happen.
So the key step that needs to happen now is that the International Panel on Climate Change needs to accept the results of this paper. Is that?
Yeah, it works kind of the other way around. So this new paper is the results of a little committee that sits inside another committee called CMIP, Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. And what CMIP does is it determines what scenarios the community, so the scientific community, should incorporate in their research, assigns them a priority, and it's evolved in such a way that CMIP is kind of an assessment service organization. They organize research, and they've done this now for 20 years or more. They organize research so that when it comes time for the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to assess that research, some order has been imposed ahead of time. And we can debate how much sense it makes to kind of stage manage research in that way. There's good resource reasons why you would do that to be more efficient. There's good scientific reasons. If everybody's using the same scenarios, you can compare apples to apples with their results. There's also some problems there because if everybody's working with the exact same scenarios and you have a single point of failure, like an assumption of too much coal, then all the research is questionable. So the scientific community generally has done this kind of behind the scenes, and it's nerdy stuff, and no one much cares. Once the scenarios became more than just inputs to climate models, they became inputs to policy, to regulation. They mattered enormously out in the real world. Then we have to take a look and say, well, do we really want this group of 15 international scientists who are smart people? I'm sure they're all wonderful people, but they have no accountability to the rest of us who are impacted by these enormously consequential decisions that they make. And I don't, in all honesty, I'm not even sure they're aware of how consequential their own decisions are.
Yeah, and you bring that point. You mentioned four problems that remain in your op-ed in the Washington Post, and the fourth is related to this committee. So maybe if you could explain a little bit more about, you say climate scenarios are produced by a small committee that operates with no governmental oversight, public consultation, or accountability proportionate to its influence. So maybe it would be worth if you could step through the history of how this committee took on so much inordinate power.
So in the geosciences and atmospheric sciences in particular, there's a long history of international coordination of research. And it goes through organizations like the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, which is in Geneva. It goes through the UN, and it goes through um, a nonprofit International Science Council, ISC. Um, and the reason, well, one reason for having this international coordination is that studying the Earth system, it doesn't matter if you're in the US or China or India or Germany, getting the world scientists together is a good idea. And if they have shared priorities and shared thinking on where the important research questions are, that can feed back into national science budgets. Um, and I imagine there's something probably pretty similar in health and in other areas. Um, and I, for in the 1990s and early 2000s in the weather area, I did a lot of work in the international community. Well, it wasn't the climate side; it was on the weather side, and got to see this, from the inside up close. A more selfish reason is that if you have a big international committee recommending research priorities, you can take that back to your national government and say, "Oh, this international committee said we need to spend, you know, $250 million on an observing system," and that feeds into the prioritization process. So it is about coordinating science, but it's also about coordinating science budgets. The climate community has long had various versions of these international committees. Um, when the IPCC came along, probably about 20 years ago, well, the IPCC started in the 1980s, but about 20 years ago, there was this idea about coordinating scenarios so as to coordinate research. And so I do have an organizational chart. I haven't released it to the world, but this little committee called Scenario MIP, Scenario Model Intercomparison Project, sits 8 levels down under what's called the WCRP, the World Climate Research Program. So it's nested pretty deep in there, and their job was pretty simple. It's just to recommend a set of scenarios for the community to use. They weren't seeking power. It wasn't about power or anything like that. But as we went from the early years of the IPCC, the first IPCC had 4 scenarios. One was called business as usual. Then we had B, C, and D, named, kind of in line with how people thought about their importance. They were just illustrative, kind of exploratory maps out into the future. Scenarios came to take on real significance, really starting 20 years ago or so. And so the decisions that this little committee makes um, have taken on such outsized importance in the world. And our governance of that committee, and I say the world's governance of that committee hasn't kept pace. So imagine if we had a committee making decisions about interest rates for countries around the world or something like that affecting central banking. And no one knows who these people are. And it's just a little committee. They don't have most of the people in this committee have a lot of expertise, but not expertise in policy or the use of scenarios in decision making. Another factor that's also deeply uncomfortable is that this committee is dominated by 2 institutions, one in Germany, one in Austria, and a small group of scholars. There's essentially no Indian representation, no African, no one from any country in Africa, no representation from China. And so these folks are making decisions that affect everyone on the planet. And they come from, quite frankly, a pretty narrow slice of people on the planet. And so that raises all sorts of questions. Now, in the literature, there has been some concern expressed that the scenarios that this committee puts out to the world, it keeps poor people poor, for example. which has nothing to do with, obviously, with climate, but the scenarios project how we're going to evolve into the future. And so if you're in India and you look at these scenarios, and they say, well, many Indians are going to be rich, but many are going to stay poor, you might say, well, let's get a different scenario. Let's get a scenario where everyone gets rich. And the scenario creators, to the extent that they engage these issues, they say, well, our job isn't to make the world equitable or rich. Our job is to deal with carbon dioxide emissions. And so a lot of the considerations that you might want to talk about in a policy relevant scenario, it's not all about carbon going into the future. So a lot of those considerations aren't prioritized in these discussions. So one of the things that I think needs to happen going forward is we need to open up this black box and figure out, this is really a science advisory body. All right. It started out maybe as a science coordination mechanism, but it has evolved into I call it the world's most important committee no one's ever heard of. Maybe or maybe not, that's true. But we do need better ways to oversee and ensure that that committee's doing a job that is now matches its purpose.
Is there any mechanism to have that happen? Because it's unclear to me, would there be any incentive for there to be any change in that committee?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same sort of questions that we might have about the IPCC. These international bodies are legitimized by the governments that oversee them. And whether it's through the World Meteorological Organization, which is a UN spinoff, or the United Nations itself, all of the funding, all of the legitimacy comes from countries. And so I've been critical of the Trump administration for pulling back from international science organizations like WHO, like the IPCC, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Um, Countries that are impacted by the decisions made by these committees have enormous influence over what they do. And so, my stance is the United States obviously has a lot of influence in these international processes. Picking up your ball and going home in a fit and saying, I'm not going to play the game is probably not a great policy. Um, the US should fix it, not abandon it. And so, I do think there are levers, but they have to be used, and it means compromise. It means bringing people to the table. I would also think that as this story gets out into the real world, we're probably going to see China and India, in particular, start to raise some concerns because their values and interests really aren't reflected in these scenarios that have come out, and yet they are often pressured in the international community on energy and climate. Doesn't mean that they respond to those pressures, but I would think that they're going to assert more interest in these sorts of committees going forward. So the path to accountability goes through national governments.
To be clear here, are you saying that the scenarios that are presented by this committee, if they give a unflattering appearance of a future for a country, that there's incentives for that future to be manifest or something? Is the idea that they don't want the projections to include large scale poverty in their country because that will make it more likely to happen?
So I'll give you a practical example. So let's say the set of scenarios describe a world in which countries on the African continent do not develop with fossil fuels. And that's the future we're going to. And then these scenarios are taken up by the World Bank and other multilateral institutions that provide investment in Africa. And they use these scenarios and say, well, our scenario says there's going to be no fossil fuels in Africa. And so you want to build a natural gas plant in Nigeria. We're not going to provide funding for that because that's not envisioned in our scenario set. So it very quickly goes from being an exploratory exercise, how might climate change, to a tool that's used to constrain the future possibilities in real places around the world. And if you're a poor person in Nigeria and you don't have access to electricity, you might think, I'll take that natural gas, just like those folks in the United States have plenty of. So there are pretty profound consequences to the scenarios.
So they're not really just like forecasts; they're also strategic plans in
Absolutely.
some ways.
Yeah, I've heard from a million people in the last few weeks since this has happened, and had an interesting conversation, very very high level, very respectful, with a leading climate modeler, and it's online. People can find it if they're industrious. But he said, your critiques might be just fine of this scenario. He said, but in our community, we don't care about the socioeconomics. All we want is some trajectory we can feed into our climate models to better understand the climate system. And I get that. That's fair. And that's his world. But I think we also have to recognize that these scenarios have implications far beyond plugging into somebody's Earth system model. And so the critique I would say of his comment is not that he's wrong in that discussion, but the total incuriosity or lack of concern about how these models affect real people in the world outside of climate science is concerning to me, because they are profoundly influential.
Well, that's an interesting point, given I've been very like adamant about trying to minimize the influence of politics on science. But here's a scenario like what you're talking about is in fact a direct tie between the science and the politics because it's directly informing policy. And are you making the argument that the scientists themselves should consider that when reporting their the models? You think that that's something that because that's kind of how we frankly, how we got into the COVID origin
Yeah,
issue
yeah.
where the so are you making the argument that it's okay in this case for them or they should in fact consider the real world, implications of how the results are being used?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're providing science advice to policymakers, and that's what this is.
Right.
The IPCC exists only to provide science advice to policymakers. Then, of course, you have to consider the policy and political context within which that advice is prepared, shared, and ultimately used. There's there, there's no um, there's no world in which we can create a big giant wall between science and policy, and we don't want to do that. We want science to be useful.
I agree, but we can't control how people are gonna use it, right? Like, as scientists, we create the knowledge or, the research, and then we provide it to the policymakers, but how they use it is out of our hands, right?
Yeah, but I guess where I depart from there is the notion of the science. So let's go back to scenarios. Should scenarios include a set where incomes around the world converge to some high level? Um,
Yes. Yeah, that makes there you go. So I think
right.
you're right in that sense, like, add in if the concern is that a policy will be taken from these scenarios that says, "Well, we need to keep people poor." Then that I see what you mean. So that
Yeah,
should be factored in, like, well, let's why and actually that's a question, then why wouldn't the scientist, develop models based on
yeah.
whatever it's called, like abundance or whatever
So
for
yeah, so if you had participation of a wide range of people from around the world reflecting a wide range of values, some people care about carbon dioxide and climate change. And, just bluntly, some people don't. They care more about poverty in their own country, or energy security. And so historically, the issue of climate change emerged with a rather narrow focus. It was humans are affecting the climate system in many ways, but primarily through carbon dioxide burned from fossil fuels. And so these models were built with a singular focus, which was to stop the accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There was not concern about, well, how do we reach convergence of per capita GDP around the world? Absolutely not. There was not concern about, well, how do we ensure energy security of Japan, given that they don't have a lot of domestic resources? Those were either secondary or tertiary or not factors at all in developing these models. It turns out that the results of climate science are fed into decision making that incorporates all these things. They go into national policy, into central banking. They go into decisions about, how do we retrofit the San Francisco airport for sea level rise. Um, you probably have to understand, well, what's air travel going to look like? How many people are going to be flying? And so you need economists and you need demographers and so on. And so, I mean, it's an emergent phenomena that we started out with a real narrow focus on a very tight question that became of outsized importance to really all questions, which would suggest a different approach to how we might model. It's really climate science has evolved from climate science about carbon dioxide to roadmaps for how do we collectively want to go into the future. And yes, there are some climate only people out there, particularly in the climate community. But for most people around the world, the future is a complicated place where we have to balance a whole bunch of different values. And that balancing is not reflected in the process. And that's why we got to this point where things have kind of broken down. Um, and some response from some of the climate people is, so what? All we care about is carbon dioxide. So everything's fine. And a lot of other people who I hear from are like, are you telling me that the information I've been relying on for the last 10 years, all of a sudden isn't viewed as plausible anymore? There's some degree of shock. And for me, like the dissonance between these communities is pretty interesting.
Okay, actually that maybe is a subject we should go on like in a future discussion to talk about at length, given what it sounds like it's kind of the opposite of what happened with respect to the COVID origins, which is you're talking about you need more voices contributing to these scenarios so that you can get a better, like that these are not restricting economies and that type of thing. So it's a different, I thought you were saying something different.
Well, I do think there are some similarities. So let's say you want to do gain of function research. So if you're a gain of function researcher and that's your narrow little world, you might say, yeah, I want to be able to do that research because it will help me understand more about viruses and so on. Um, but in the real world, people care about biosecurity and the consequences of doing this research and what we might discover. And so you will want to have a wider range of voices. You'll want to have, biodefense people. You want to have ethicists. You want to have religious people talking about, should we be doing this research? You don't want it to be controlled only by the people doing the research for their narrow purposes. So I do think that the ground rules for doing research are ask the same sort of questions in both contexts.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I was thinking of the opposite in the sense of like the client, like the scientists could be withholding information in order to like, modulate how policymakers or, manipulate how policymakers would make decisions rather than like what you're talking about is opening it up to get more input from people all across the world that would have different ideas of what matters, and that's going to give you better scenarios, better models, and
That's a
then
big part of it. Yeah.
better policies for the world, which may not be better for particular nations.
Right. I mean, that's why science advice is really tricky and difficult. And all this plays out anyway in the IPCC and elsewhere. Um, and opening things up you'd get more useful science, but hopefully also more accurate and up to date science.
One thing you brought up that I wanted to touch on quickly was you brought up this the label of business as usual, and you said, and I saw it written about. I think you wrote about it, perhaps that like this extreme scenario became business as usual, right? Or was at least pitched that way in the media, and how that label has become extremely damaging since I guess this first came out in 2014. This scenario.
This scenario came out in 2011. RCP 8.4.
2011, okay.
Yeah.
But it was but it but I guess I think it was it known since, like, 2017 that this scenario was implausible?
Yeah.
Like, so it's been about 10 years,
Right.
but nevertheless, this scenario has been the thing, this RCP 8.5 has been the scenario that's been held up by the climate alarmist, advocates to say we need to, like, change everything we're doing in society.
Yeah, it's an apocalypse scenario. I mean, it's and to understand this again, it's you got to go into the history and down in the weeds. But 26 years ago, 2000, the IPCC came out with a report, special report on emission scenarios. It's like this thick, it's giant. At that time, they leaned on the people who were experts, not in climate, but experts in scenarios. And that report came up with 40 different scenarios of the future. And for people need to understand that scenarios are not predictions. So if you and I are talking, where are we going to go to dinner tonight? We can say, oh yeah, we could go to a pizza place, and I might like a pepperoni, or you might say, oh, I want to get kung pao chicken. We'll go to this Chinese place. We're not predicting where we're going. We're talking about our options, different routes into the future. So scenarios in 2000 were presented not with likelihoods or probabilities. They were a function, like, we could make different choices collectively on planet Earth and wind up in very different places. And they provided 40 scenarios. Some had very low carbon dioxide emissions out in the future. Some had very high. And what the IPCC said was, we can't assign any one of these as more likely than any others. So use this to inform your decision making. And that's what scenarios do. It'll be a little bit like you and I arguing not over kung pao chicken versus pepperoni pizza, but what's the likelihood we're going to get kung pao chicken? You might say, well, I think there's a 65% chance we're going to get kung pao chicken. And, arguing about the probabilities is very different than arguing about where we want to eat. And so there was a debate that emerged right away in the scientific community. And some people said, well, if you give policymakers 40 different scenarios with none more likely than another, then they might think that these very favorable looking scenarios could come true without us putting any pressure on them. And, we really need to assign probabilities to scenarios. And those folks won out. And very quickly in 2005, there was a restart on the scenario process. And so they went from 40 scenarios with no likelihood to 4, with one assigned, as you mentioned, business as usual. People get hung up on the wording business as usual, but they're also called reference scenarios or a baseline scenario. It basically means this is where we're headed. This is our most likely future if we don't change course. That scenario was chosen to be RCP 8.5, the most extreme scenario. One of the problems was no one asked, is it plausible? Forget about how likely it is. Is it even possible?
Well, Roger, when you say it was chosen, who chose it? Like, who chose that as that must have been that little committee chose that, or did somebody above them?
The grandparents, great-grandparents of this little committee.
Okay.
So another committee chose it. At that time, it was actually the IPCC that was choosing scenarios that it was later going to assess. But yes, a small little group. And, I have in my files, warnings. Don't use RCP 8.5 as a baseline. It's not the most likely scenario. That got thrown out very early on and, was never corrected. So there was a good indication, a good understanding by people, of what could go wrong with this process. But it's important to understand that there was only one baseline scenario selected. So in the SRES, you had 40 baselines, 40 different ways the future could evolve. And we quickly went to a situation where there was one, just one, RCP 8.5. And so if all you're doing is exploratory climate modeling, pick whatever scenario you want. Get RCP 26.4, whatever. No one cares. But if these scenarios have the parallel role of informing decision making, assigning one single future is enormously problematic because we can't predict the future. That's why we use scenarios.
Right. Although the problem, as you point out, is that we can't predict the future, but then these scenarios are used by people in positions of power to direct how the future,
Exactly. Yeah.
so it's interesting. Like,
Yeah.
these are okay. So you say that these scenarios, they really should be like, these are thought experiments, right?
Yes.
But not forecasts, and then certainly not strategic plans. And
Absolutely.
so, that's maybe the sort of take home here is, how do you get away from making these strategic plans rather than thought experiments and another issue you bring up is that there's not really a mechanism right now to sort of update these and more quicker.
Right.
That they get baked into policy, they get baked into the culture, and then unwinding them is quite challenging.
Yeah. I mean, let me just say, I mean, it's shocking to me that we're talking about RCP 8.5, which is used widely in policy in 2026. It comes from a scenario in that original IPCC SRES set called A2, which is developed by the Message Integrated Assessment Model. It has its origins in the 1980s, 1990s, was updated in 2007, and then became RCP 8.5. So literally, decision makers relying on RCP 8.5 are using state-of-the-art knowledge as of 1988 to guide decisions in 2026. And so, yes, there has to be a more frequent updating if we're going to think of these scenarios as policy relevant.
So in order for that to occur, I'm big on the idea that there must be incentives to change. So what would be the incentives to change the current way in which, climate science is used to develop climate policy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. So the incentives are science matters, climate change matters, and how we go into the future. We want the best available information, and so it's all going to go back to national governments. If national governments are concerned that they're not getting the best available science to inform their decision making, that's a pretty strong incentive to say, hey, we need to up our game. We need better science. One thing that could happen is that climate research could split into parallel paths. There could be a path focused on exploratory climate research. A climate scientist yesterday reminded me that before there were scenarios, climate research used to input 2 times CO2 and 4 times CO2 just as round numbers into their models. So take today's CO2 level, double it, and see what happens in your model. And there was no pretense about describing a future world. It was just an exploratory approach to research. So we could have that type of climate research out there. Then we could have a parallel path, which is policy relevant research, where you have scenarios updated, ideally annually at the slowest. And I mean, the Iran war is going to have enormous consequences for energy and economics around the world. All of the scenarios developed before that war are out of date because we're in a different world now. And none of them, I can tell you, no scenario baked in an assumption of a big Middle East war in 2026. And so policy relevant science needs to be much more nimble, much quicker, and able to respond to what happens in the real world. So I think the parallel paths, it would take some of the pressure off of climate science to justify itself in terms of immediate policy relevance, as often is the case. It would also allow us to open the door to doing science differently so that it's more responsive to the needs of decision makers.
So, what is the United States' role right now in the IPCC? I mean, you mentioned that you have expressed concerns. Maybe we have different opinions about the United States withdrawing from the WHO, for example. Like, I was fine with that. But they also, are you saying recently they also stepped back from roles within the IPCC, or can you explain where that stands?
Yeah, so the I in IPCC is intergovernmental. And so it's an international body that's under the United Nations, World Meteorological Organization, which is a United Nations spinoff. Um, that I have said, I testified before Congress on many occasions that if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Because if you want to have knowledge of what climate science is saying, you have to assess it because there's hundreds of thousands of papers published every year. Maybe in the future, AI can take over some of these tasks, but up to now, we need humans to assess what the science says and doesn't say. The IPCC, any science advisory body, anyone, and we see this in health as well, is subject to political influence because people want the outcome of science to go in a certain direction sometimes. No surprise there. And so building strong institutions that are connected to politics but protected from politics is a really daunting task, as we've seen. So the United States has withdrawn formally from the IPCC and the parent agreement. Trump has said we've withdrawn from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the international architecture for discussions about how to collectively respond to climate change. It's not clear whether he can actually withdraw because there's some details having to do with the Senate and things like that. But for all intents and purposes, the U.S. is not participating. I'm a big supporter of being at the table. So the U.S. might not like the WHO, might not like its leadership, might not like Chinese influence, whatever it is. In all circumstances, it's better to be at the table in these international science bodies than not at the table. Um, so it's unclear what role the United States actually has because U.S. scientists are still free to participate in these bodies. I think that the U.S. withdrawal from the IPCC, for example, is going to open the door to a greater politicization of that body. And given their enormous influence around the world, you're going to see interests of countries other than the United States probably reflected, and maybe not even of countries, maybe of individual researchers or research teams, reflected to a greater degree. So if the goal is to have the best available science accurately represented, then having someone at the table who cares about that matters. Right now, it's not the United States.
People generally are very pissed off about how much the doom and gloom climate scenarios and whatnot have been used to change their lives. In New Jersey, for example, like they've served as the basis for a lot of local policies that people are just like, what the heck is this? This makes no sense. Like
Right.
we can't, the straws or whatever, like
Right.
plastic bags and stuff. And so the question then is, can you explain why they should care? Like why, climate science is saying that the climate is changing, that and that those changes will have economic impacts, whether or not can you actually sort of explain why it's important to care about this, even though there's a lot of sort of manipulation and lies, through the media, through government?
For a long time, there were efforts made to try to implement climate policies. We'll just put it in that big bucket. It's really energy policies, but climate policies through Congress, and that didn't work so well. It hasn't worked so well, and so um, people in the climate lobby decided, well, the regulatory and the legal route is where we'll go. Let's go through the executive branch, and we'll go through the courts. And in regulation, so how much you might pay for a car or a light bulb or anything, your electricity bill. Um, if you want to regulate something, you have to have some justification as to what the costs and benefits are. And these models or these scenarios or variations of them um, were used to come up with something called the social cost of carbon. So every ton of carbon that's emitted is associated with some impact on society, some price. And that price can be used to regulate. And we can put a surcharge on your car, on your electricity bill. And turns out that social cost of carbon is a very plastic, kind of malleable number. For example, under the Biden administration, I think memory recalls it was like $170 a ton. And under the first Trump administration, it was like $7 a ton. That difference feeds into people's household expenses.
Well, wait, Roger, why are we even doing that? Like, why even have this idea? Like, why do we need a social cost of carbon? That maybe it gets at the fundamental question, like, why? Why even include any of these things in policies?
So if you ask, so the formal justification given by climate advocates is that carbon dioxide emissions have real costs, and if we want to eliminate them, we're going to have to recognize those costs that aren't priced in our consumption and production of energy. And it turns out that everything we do, from the glasses on your face to the clothes you're wearing to the lights that we're powering our conversation, comes from energy. And so the idea that you change the energy economy by pricing in the cost of climate change is the justification. And for many people, the idea was, well, the higher the price we can put on carbon, the more change we're going to have. And that's probably true, except the change that we get is not to decarbonize the economy. It's people get pissed off, like you say, and they vote for populists who tell them they're going to give them, $3 gasoline, or, so they're going to lower their expenses. That's always more popular than saying we're going to deal with this invisible gas that's going to raise temperatures by a few degrees. So that
Well,
was
not necessarily, Roger, because climate change is a winning. I mean, it has been popular. Like people do, run whole campaigns and get votes by saying we're going to save the planet. Like, so I wouldn't say that. It is odd, though, that like people will vote for candidates that will implement policies that increase everyday, inconvenience everyday life and increase prices, right? So I'm not saying it's not actually unpopular. I don't think it's unpopular. It's unpopular with a certain segment, but it's popular with another. So I guess the question really is there a better way, frankly, than, using economic levers to change behavior on a grand scale? Is that really where we want to go with this? I don't know. That maybe is a much larger question. I don't
No,
know
yeah,
if
it is a big question. I mean, I'll just say, right before the 2024 election, Rui Teixeira, a colleague at AEI, American Enterprise Institute, and we did a survey, a national survey of what Americans think about climate and energy. And, it's a year and a half old, I guess, and it's not current. But what we found was that most Americans, number one, they care about climate change, and they think it's real. And, there's a partisan divide there. But at the same time, those exact same Americans don't want to pay anything to deal with it. So climate change is popular when it's a symbol. It's not so popular when it translates into higher price energy. And so, Joe Biden famously used the, concern about climate change as an existential threat, which can be traced directly back to RCP 8.5. And the agenda of climate change has proven to be so unpopular that in 2026, most Democrats won't even mention the topic. And there are some Democrats who, the governor of New York is saying, well, we're going to start talking about restarting nuclear power plant. We're going to talk about building pipelines, things that were off the table. In Germany, Germany famously shut down all these fantastic, well-running nuclear power plants, part of a climate policy agenda. And the chancellor of Germany earlier this year, Friedrich Merz, said that was a mistake. If you would have given me odds on the German chancellor saying the nuclear phase out was a mistake, 2 years ago, I would have said that's never going to happen. The climate agenda has suffered enormous hits over the last year and a half. It's not a Trump phenomenon. It's worldwide. And I think it's because energy policy has become real again. The costs of everything from fertilizer to diesel to gasoline, electricity are going up around the world, and people are always going to prioritize their household economics over some threat of climate change, even though they might say, yeah, I really care about climate change. But if you say, all right, open your wallet and give us some money. We asked in our poll, we asked Americans, would you accept a $1 fee on your utility bill to deal with climate change? That had a narrow win, like 47 to 45% said yes. When you go above $1 a month for climate policy, it's enormously unfavorable, and it's a bipartisan consensus. No one wants to pay $10 a month for climate change. Well, maybe 20% of people do, but it's not a popular agenda right now.
I think that might get more into people not trusting the government is a good steward with the money that they're provided, right? Like that might, but
Yeah, it's obviously mixed up with trust of institutions and so on. But
yeah,
if the consequence of paying that money is that you have higher priced utility bills, people are like, yeah, I don't like that policy.
yeah,
That's not.
but I guess in a sense, so what you're describing is a course correction, or it's sort of, returning to something a little bit more, in line with reality when people are balancing, concerns about climate change with, instead of thinking like we need to act immediately or we're all going to die in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. What's happening now is a sort of return to sort of, more reasonable positions about this, which I think is a very good thing. I guess the question is, what's the path forward look like?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a longtime supporter of decarbonizing the economy. I think it's important. Um, but the only way we get there is, as you say, through more pragmatic, realistic approach to these policies. So, I mean, I have a couple concerns. One is that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you look at Trump's tweet on RCP 8.5, it's, oh, this is a hoax and it's, there's not real, but don't worry about it. I don't think that's the right stance. It's obviously not the right stance. We're all going to die by 2030 either. Um, but one thing that it seems should be obvious to everyone now, whatever they think about climate change, is we need copious amounts of energy on this planet. We need more electricity. People talk about data centers and AI, and there's a battle in some places like, well, let's not build them because that they're going to use too much energy and too much water. I mean, those people would be surprised to see how much water we use for almonds or things like that. Limiting economic growth and technology is it's not the way forward. We need to figure out how to produce more energy, more electricity in particular, more quickly. And if you think data centers are going to consume a lot of energy, look at air conditioning in India. I mean, look at the demands for energy all around the world. It's the curve's going to go up. And so figuring out how to provide energy services to the 5 or 6 billion who don't have what you and I have, to me, offers a much better route towards innovation and decarbonization than trying to constrict the use of energy or making energy more expensive.
All right. Well, I guess, do you have any final words, Roger? Because I'm going to let you go this morning, because we're going to have a lot more to talk about related to this. And anything, well, wait, before I ask you for your final words, like, what has been you said you were talking to like millions of people the last few weeks. So what's gone on personally with you? Have you felt like a bit of a sense of vindication? Have anyone said, hey, Roger, sorry for sort of, like ostracizing you or like marginalizing you before, or not? Is it more any of that going on? Any job offers? Have any universities reach out to you and said, hey, you know what? Why don't you come back and we do a climate policy center with someone that's actually not insane?
No, none of that's
No.
happened. It's interesting because last month I sat down with John Stossel. Many people know who John Stossel is. And for his YouTube show, this was before RCP 8.5 got taken away. And he basically wanted to tell my story of having the Obama White House come after me and investigated by Congress and, push out of my university. And he did a fantastic 13-minute video, which came out, I don't know, last week, after the RCP 8.5 stuff broke. And I think a lot of people have learned about my experiences that maybe knew who I was, but didn't know exactly how I got to be doing what I'm doing. And so that's been very interesting because I've had a lot of responses from that. At the same time, the climate crazies, which include some people from academia and science, have decided that they need to come back after me on social media and so on. And go for it. I've had mean tweets. It's fine. It's it's a little bit everything is kind of amped up compared to what it was before, and not much has changed. It's fine. I think I have talked to reporters at the New York Times who I've never talked to before, and it's kind of hard to deny now the arguments that I and my colleagues, Justin Ritchie, Matt Burgess, shout out, have been doing for a long time now. And that was favorably accepted by one chapter in the IPCC last time. So none of this should be a surprise to anybody. It's certainly not a surprise to us. Maybe the timing is a surprise, but in the end, science is self-correcting. And if you have good arguments, good data, the real world can't separate from that forever. And so I'm just happy to see that there is a course correction underway. We're just at the beginning. This is going to play out for years. And I don't think many people really understand the magnitude of how significant a change this is. They will eventually.
But I got to say, I was so excited for you, frankly, just on a personal level, to see like the last couple weeks unfold. And I didn't realize the Stossel interview had happened before the RCP 8.5 thing came out. So it was really great timing. So congratulations, Roger. Really, I think that very well deserved getting attention. And I'm really, I'm honored to be able to do like some videos with you and continue to do them on this subject, because I think it's, like you say, it's incredibly important. And also when I began the series, I said, I don't know much about this at all, and I want to learn more because I think the dynamics of this are similar to the dynamics that I've been, facing in the gain of function
Right.
debate and trying, um, and it in many ways gets to this idea of like, you said science is self-correcting, but also having, transparency, honesty,
Yep.
and, trying to provide the best information, the most accurate information to the public. And in this case, to governments and banks and whatnot is extremely important. And, so I really appreciate your work in that regard. So, um, good luck. What do you have any more interviews, big interviews coming up with anyone that you want to break here or anything like that?
No, I'm gonna go on vacation for a few weeks.
Okay. All
So,
right. Well, well deserved.
yeah, I appreciate it. And one of these, let's do one of these where I interview you, and I wanna talk about gain of function and your experiences in that, because I do think, if science is self-correcting, then at some point down the line, and it could be tomorrow or it could be 10 years from now, we're going to have a lot more certainty about the origins of COVID than is present in the contentious public debate right now. Um, and just like RCP 8.5, um, it's inevitable that we'll know more, and things will align with reality. It just may take a while.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And certainly, yeah, I mean, we could chat about gain of function and the current whatever's going on. A lot of
Yeah.
interesting developments in my space the last
Yeah,
week and
for
a half,
sure.
frankly. Um, but but let's focus on climate here, Roger. And thanks again. Thanks again for joining me, Roger. I really appreciate it. And until next time, my name is Bryce Nickels. This has been Science from the Fringes in defense of climate change. Take care, everybody.
One